Imagine being pulled over for no reason, harassed in front of strangers, and taken away in handcuffs. Now imagine waking up the next day in a courtroom, as the one holding the power to decide the fate of the very officers who arrested you. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about justice, power, and a twist no one saw coming. How does a man who was once a victim of police brutality become the one to hold the law accountable? Stay tuned to find out. Asen Walker was the kind of man who blended into the background. He wasn't famous, didn't chase headlines, and wasn't seeking attention. A quiet, hard-working father of two, Jason worked at a small auto repair shop, just outside of town. His life wasn't perfect, but it was simple. He had his family, his job, and a routine that felt safe. Every day after finishing a long shift, he'd stop by the gas station on his way home. It wasn't a special place. Just a place where he could grab a drink and maybe chat with the clerk for a few minutes before getting back on the road. Jason's world revolved around his family. His kids were his pride, his wife, Maria, was his rock. He worked hard for them, making sure the bills were paid, the car was running, and the house was well kept. To him, that was success. But that evening, as Jason walked into the gas station to pay for his coffee, something was different. The air felt heavier, like the tension you feel when a storm is coming but you can't yet see the clouds. He wasn't aware of it yet. But this small, unremarkable stop would mark the beginning of a nightmare, a moment that would shatter the calm of his life and expose a world of injustice he never thought possible. The officers had been watching him for a while. Jason didn't know them, but they knew him. Or at least, they thought they did. It was just another gas station, another night. Or so it seemed. But in that quiet moment, with nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, Jason's life was about to change forever. Jason had no idea that the officers were watching him. The sound of his boots tapping on the pavement echoed in the quiet of the gas station parking lot as he made his way inside, lost in his thoughts. He was thinking about the work he had to finish when he got home, something about fixing a transmission before the weekend, but mostly he was thinking about his kids. His son, Jamal, had been struggling with his homework lately, and Jason wanted to be there to help him through it. He hadn't even noticed the car pull in next to him, or the two officers stepping out. They were in plain clothes. Nothing about them stood out except for the way they approached him. The first one, a tall man with a gruff face, spoke first. "Hey, you!" he barked. Jason froze. There was no reason for anyone to be talking to him like that, especially not in a place as ordinary as a gas station. He turned slowly, trying to read the situation, trying to gauge whether this was some sort of mistake. He didn't feel like he was doing anything wrong, just standing in line to pay for a cup of coffee. But the officer wasn't interested in explanations. "Yeah, you! Step outside," the officer ordered, his voice sharp, impatient. Jason's stomach tightened. He took a step back, glancing at the clerk behind the counter who was now avoiding eye contact. That's when Jason noticed the second officer standing by the door, arms folded across his chest, eyes locked on him. There was no warmth in his eyes, only cold, calculated judgment. "Is there a problem?" Jason asked, trying to keep his voice even, but his pulse was quickening. He knew something wasn't right. "We'll figure that out outside," the officer replied, taking a step forward. Jason could feel his chest tighten as the officer moved in. The situation was spiraling, and he had no control over it. A part of him wanted to resist, to ask what he had done wrong, but he had seen enough to know how things could go south fast. He had seen the videos, the stories, the headlines. He didn't want to become one of them. He turned to leave the store, his heart hammering in his chest. Maybe if he cooperated, it would all blow over. But the moment his feet hit the pavement, something shifted. The officers weren't just following him. They were surrounding him. "Hey, I'm just trying to pay for my coffee," Jason said, trying to stay calm. The officer who had spoken to him earlier wasn't having it. Without warning, he grabbed Jason's arm and yanked him toward the sidewalk. Jason stumbled, trying to regain his balance, but the officer's grip tightened. "What's going on?" Jason asked again, the panic starting to creep in. His mind was racing. Was this some sort of mistake? What did they think he had done? "You're being detained," the officer said, voice steely. "Detained for what?" Jason managed to say, his voice rising slightly. The officer wasn't answering. Instead, the second officer stepped in and placed a hand on Jason's shoulder, forcing him down against the car. Jason's mind was spinning. The world seemed to close in on him as the officers pressed harder, his breath quickening. Why had they singled him out? Was it because he was black? Was it because of his clothes? Or something else entirely? None of it made sense, but Jason couldn't afford to question it right now. The more he resisted, the worse it would get. But then he heard the familiar screech of sirens. He looked up, seeing 2 more police cars pulling into the parking lot. 4 more officers stepped out. All of them trained their eyes on him. He was surrounded. "Stay down!" one of them shouted, and before he could react, Jason felt the cold metal of handcuffs closing around his wrists. The world felt like it was moving in slow motion. Jason's mind was still reeling, struggling to make sense of what was happening. The officers never told him why they were arresting him, never gave him a chance to explain. They didn't care. They just saw him, a black man in a seemingly innocuous situation, and made their judgment. As they shoved him into the back of a police car, Jason could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. He wasn't sure what they would charge him with. Hell, he wasn't sure if they even had a charge at all. All he knew was that he had been thrown into a nightmare that he couldn't escape. But the nightmare didn't end there. Jason hadn't even realized the full extent of what was happening until they reached the precinct. As he was processed and thrown into a holding cell, his mind began to turn. Was this just another case of mistaken identity? Or had something deeper, more sinister, been at play? That night, he lay awake in the cold, sterile cell, unable to shake the feeling that this wasn't just about an arrest. This was about power, about control, about a system that saw him, and so many like him, as expendable. The next morning, the situation took an even darker turn. Jason's phone rang. It was Maria, his wife. "Jason, I just got a call." Her voice was shaky. "The officers, they're pressing charges. They're saying you were resisting arrest. You're looking at serious time." Jason's heart dropped. The officers had twisted the truth to fit their narrative. He knew that wasn't the whole story, but how could he fight back against something like this? How could he prove that he hadn't done anything wrong when the police held all the cards? But it wasn't just the charges. The worst part was yet to come. A few hours later, Jason was escorted into a courtroom for his hearing. His stomach churned as he walked through the cold, echoing halls, the weight of the chains around his wrists making each step feel heavier. He had no idea what to expect. But when they brought him into the courtroom, something happened that no one, least of all him, could have predicted. The judge walked in, her robe swaying as she took her seat behind the bench. But when she raised her head, Jason's breath caught in his throat. It was her. The same woman he had seen at the gas station the night before. The one who had been standing with the officers, watching him from a distance, barely acknowledging his existence. The one who had seemed so detached, so cold. Now here she was, presiding over his fate. Jason's mind raced. Was this just a coincidence? Was it possible that someone like her, someone who had witnessed what happened, could be impartial in a case like his? Was she even capable of understanding the injustice that had been done? But as she looked down at him, he realized it didn't matter. The system was already rigged, and Jason was just another pawn in a game he couldn't win. Jason sat in the courtroom, his hands trembling as they gripped the cold metal chair. The judge, the woman from the gas station, was at the bench, but she barely looked at him. She was too busy flipping through papers, scanning his file like, It was just another routine case. Like his life, his future, didn't matter at all. The air felt suffocating. Jason's chest tightened, his breath shallow. His mind raced, but there was only one thought that kept repeating. I shouldn't be here. He had done nothing wrong. He'd tried to comply, tried to stay calm, but all that had led him to this moment was fear. Fear that if he made a wrong move, it would be over. Fear that the world he thought he knew was nothing more than a thin veil, pulled back to reveal the ugly reality beneath. The prosecutor's voice broke through the haze in his mind, sharp and unwavering. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have clear evidence of Mr. Walker's resistance to law enforcement. His actions, both before and after the arrest, show a blatant disregard for authority. We ask you to consider this as you deliberate. Jason could feel the weight of every word. The lies were so clean, so polished. How easily the truth could be twisted when the right people held the power to shape the narrative. He hadn't resisted. He had been scared. Scared of what would happen if he said no, scared of what would happen if he made a scene. But to the system, fear was resistance. To the officers, his very existence was an offense. His only crime was being black in a place where blackness was criminalized. The prosecutor finished, and Jason could feel the stares from the jury. Their eyes, cold, disinterested, seemed to cut through him. It didn't matter that he was innocent. It didn't matter that he was just a man trying to live his life. They had already decided who he was. Then the defense attorney stood up, his voice quieter, less assured than the prosecutor's. Jason could barely hear him through the pounding in his ears, but the words still made their way through the fog of his panic. We ask the court to consider the context in which these events unfolded. Mr. Walker's arrest was not initiated by any wrongdoing on his part. We're asking you to question the conduct of the officers involved. He was treated as a suspect simply because of his appearance, simply because of the color of his skin. Jason couldn't believe it. The defense was finally saying the words he had been too scared to say. The words he had held inside, knowing that no one would listen. The defense attorney continued, Mr. Walker should never have been detained. The arrest was not only unlawful, but based on racial bias. It was an act of systemic injustice. The judge's face remained emotionless. She didn't even acknowledge the weight of those words. The jury seemed indifferent, their faces unreadable. Jason felt as though the room was closing in on him. It was too much. He wanted to scream, to stand up and demand they see him, hear him, understand him. But he stayed silent, knowing that any outburst would only seal his fate. His mind flickered back to the gas station. The moment when he'd first felt the officers' eyes on him, the way they had singled him out, the way their bodies had blocked his every path. He was never meant to leave that parking lot. They had made their decision long before he stepped into that store, but here he was, still standing, or sitting in this case. The system wanted him broken. The system wanted him to believe that his life was disposable. But Jason wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The judge finally spoke, her voice cold as she declared, "The jury will now deliberate. We will reconvene in 1 hour." Jason's heart sank. The deliberation felt like a death sentence. He didn't trust the jury. He didn't trust the system. He couldn't. Every part of him screamed that they would find him guilty. No matter what evidence or truth was laid before them, the odds were stacked against him in ways he didn't even know how to explain. As the courtroom began to empty, Jason was led back to the holding cell. The guards didn't speak to him. They just shoved him along, their presence oppressive, dehumanizing. When they closed the door behind him, locking it with a sharp metallic click, Jason sank onto the cold bench. His hands were still cuffed, his body stiff with anxiety. His mind raced. What if they convict me? What will happen to my family? What will happen to my kids? The thought of Maria, his wife, kept him grounded. She was the one who had always kept him strong, but even she couldn't protect him from this. She couldn't stop the wheels of the system from grinding down on him. Jason wanted to scream, to throw something, to break free from the shackles that seemed to hold him not just physically, but mentally. But as the seconds ticked by in that sterile, cold cell, all he could do was wait for the outcome that would determine the rest of his life. But just as he was about to lose hope, the door to his cell opened. It was the defense attorney. His face was tight, but there was something in his eyes that Jason couldn't quite place. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was something else. "Jason," the lawyer said, his voice low, "we've got some good news. The jury is—" Jason stood up abruptly, his heart pounding. "Wait, what do you mean? What's happening?" The attorney hesitated for a moment. "The jury, well, they're split. Some want to acquit you, but others—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Some of them don't think the evidence is enough to convict. They're unsure, but they're pushing for a mistrial." Jason's heart stopped for a second. A mistrial? It was a moment of reprieve, but it was fleeting, a temporary victory. His mind flashed to what would come next. Would the officers face any consequences? Would this cycle continue, as it always had? And even if the jury did acquit him, would the stain of this arrest ever fade? As the attorney stepped back, closing the door behind him, Jason's mind was consumed with one thought. What does justice really look like in a world where you are already presumed guilty before you even speak? The silence of the cell was deafening, and Jason's heart thudded in his chest as he prepared for whatever would come next. He could hear his breath coming in ragged gasps. He wasn't sure if he was more afraid of the verdict or the painful reality that even if he walked free today, the fight wasn't over. The tension in Jason's chest didn't fade as the hours passed. The weight of the jury's deliberation, the uncertainty hanging in the air, felt like a constant pressure on his soul. The defense attorney had left him with a glimmer of hope, but that hope was fragile, like a thread that could snap at any moment. He sat there in the cold, lonely cell, running his hands through his hair, trying to hold on to the quiet flicker of hope that had sparked in him. But his thoughts were tangled. About Maria, about his kids, about the life he had worked so hard to build. All of it felt like it was slipping through his fingers like a cruel joke, and the worst part was that he couldn't do a thing to change it. And then the door opened again. This time, it wasn't the defense attorney. It was a guard who walked in with a grim expression. "Walker," the guard said. "You're up." Jason's heart skipped a beat. He stood, his knees feeling weak as he was escorted back to the courtroom. His mind was still swimming, unsure of what to expect, unsure whether this would be the moment when the world turned against him completely. As they walked through the long hallway to the courtroom, Jason couldn't help but feel a surge of anger rising in him. How could this have happened? How could he be standing here in handcuffs when all he had done was exist in the wrong place at the wrong time? And more than that, how could this be the reality for so many people every single day? The black bodies, the marginalized communities, who were forced to prove their worth, their humanity, over and over again just to survive. When they arrived in the courtroom, the judge was already there, her gavel poised above the stand. The jury was seated, the room heavy with anticipation. Jason's defense attorney was standing near the bench, talking to the prosecutor in hushed tones. Jason couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could feel the eyes of the jury on him, the cold, calculating gaze of people who would decide whether or not he would spend years behind bars for something he didn't do. The judge stood up, her voice cutting through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" Jason's throat tightened. He didn't even realize he had stopped breathing until the air seemed to leave his lungs in one rushed exhale. One of the jurors stood, holding a piece of paper in their hand. The room was utterly still. "We, the jury, find the defendant Jason Walker not guilty on all charges." The words were a hammer crashing into Jason's chest. Not guilty. He blinked, trying to process what he was hearing. His mind was too foggy, too overwhelmed with disbelief to fully understand what had just happened. The weight of the handcuffs around his wrists felt heavier than it had before, but for a different reason. He wasn't guilty. But the fact that he had been arrested at all, the fact that the system had tried to crush him, that would never go away. Jason was free, but nothing about this felt like a victory. In fact, it felt more like an indictment, a reminder of how easily his life could have been taken from him. He could have been just another name in the headlines, another black man who never got justice, another casualty of a broken system. As he was released from the handcuffs and led out of the courtroom, Jason felt the eyes of the crowd following him. The reporters had gathered in the hallway, their cameras clicking. The flashing lights seemed to blur together, and Jason wondered, do they see me? Or are they just seeing the story? He stepped into the open air, finally able to breathe again, but there was no real relief. The case was over, but the damage had been done. He had been branded. They had tried to erase his dignity. As he walked out, Maria was there, her eyes wide. With relief, her arms opening to him. She embraced him tightly, and for a moment, Jason felt something like peace. Only for a moment, though, because the reality of the system still hung over them, like a dark cloud that would never fully dissipate. He had been lucky. He had won this round, but how many others hadn't? Maria held him close, but even she couldn't take away the questions. That haunted him. Would it be enough to change things? Would this fight ever stop? And more than anything, would anyone ever understand the true cost of this kind of injustice? Not just in terms of lost time, but in terms of broken trust, of dignity lost, of the daily weight of knowing that one's life could be snatched away without warning or reason. Jason's freedom, hard-won and fragile, felt like a bittersweet victory. The truth had been bent, distorted, and manipulated, but today it had been allowed to surface. For him, for his family, for his kids, this time they could breathe. But what about the next man? What about the next woman? The next child who faces the same oppressive weight of a system that doesn't protect them? What happens to them when they don't have the privilege of a jury who questions the system, of a defense attorney willing to stand up for what's right? Jason walked away from the courthouse that day with a renewed sense of purpose. His life hadn't been defined by this moment, but this moment had certainly defined the world around him. He could no longer ignore the injustices that had always lurked beneath the surface. He had to keep fighting, not just for himself, but for every single person who had ever been treated like he had been. Every single person who had been forced to live in fear, forced to question whether their next breath would be their last. It wasn't just about one arrest. It was about the hundreds of thousands of lives, stories, and futures that had been stolen simply because of the color of their skin. It was about the reality that racism wasn't something confined to history books. It was alive and well, embedded in every system, every institution, every corner of society. Jason had won this battle, but the war was far from over, and so, as he stood on those courthouse steps, looking out at the world before him, one question echoed in his mind. When will this end? The fight wasn't just his anymore, it was everyone's. And if we don't change the system, if we don't stand up for those who have no voice, this cycle of pain, of injustice, will continue. So, what will you do? Will you keep standing by and watching? Or will you be part of the change?